Imagine a person who may appear completely normal on the outside. They may have a family, a job, friends, and an ordinary life. And then something so terrifying happens that only one question remains. What was actually happening inside their mind? If you're interested in the darker sides of human psychology, subscribe to the channel, because today we're going to examine some of the most disturbing and psychologically complex cases of the last few decades. And importantly, this is not an attempt to justify criminals. We will try to understand the mechanisms that may lie behind such actions: manipulation, a pathological need for control, psychosis, a lack of empathy, and the ability to lead a double life. Lindsay Clancy, when the question is, crime or psychosis? Let's begin with one of the most controversial cases of recent years. On January 24th, 2023, in Duxbury, Massachusetts, Lindsay Clancy killed her 3 children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. After that, she jumped from a second-story window in an attempt to take her own life, but survived. And this is where the most difficult part of this story begins. The defense does not deny that Clancy was responsible for the deaths of the children, but it argues that at the time of the tragedy, she was in a severe mental state associated with postpartum psychosis. According to the defense, she may have heard voices, experienced hallucinations, and lost her normal perception of reality. The prosecution, however, insists on a different version, that her actions were conscious and planned. And this is where an incredibly difficult psychological question arises. Can a person appear completely organized, talk, plan their actions, and at the same time be in a psychotic state? Yes. Psychosis does not necessarily look like a person screaming or not understanding where they are. A person may perform ordinary actions while simultaneously having a seriously distorted perception of reality. That is why the Clancy case became a collision not only between criminal law, but also psychiatry and psychology. And importantly, as of August 2026, her case is still in court, so the final conclusion regarding her guilt and mental state has not yet been made. Chris Watts. How can a person live a double life? Now, a completely different story. In August 2018, Chris Watts killed his pregnant wife, Shanann, and their 2 young daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Shanann was pregnant with their 3rd child at the time. But what shocked people the most was his behavior after the crime. Watts initially created the impression of a husband who did not know where his family was. He even addressed his wife through cameras, urging her to come home. But later, it was revealed that his family was already dead. He confessed his guilt and received several life sentences without the possibility of parole. Psychologically, this case is especially interesting because of the contrast between a person's outward image and their hidden behavior. He was a husband, a father, he had a job, he lived an ordinary life, and at the same time, he was hiding from the people closest to him what was actually happening inside his mind. This makes us wonder, how well do we really know even the people closest to us? We tend to think that years of living together automatically mean a complete understanding of a person, but someone can hide part of their personality for years. And it was precisely this mismatch between the image of an ordinary man and the scale of the crime that made the Watts case one of the most discussed criminal stories of recent years. Luka Magnotta, when a person creates their own terrifying legend. There are criminals who try to remain unknown. And then there are those who seem to want people to talk about them. Luka Magnotta became one of the most unusual examples of this type of behavior. In 2012, he killed Chinese student Jun Lin in Montreal. After the crime, a video of the murder appeared online, causing an international outcry. Magnotta attempted to flee Canada, but was found and arrested in Berlin. At trial, the defense argued that he had serious mental problems and could not fully control his actions, but the court found him guilty of first-degree murder. And this is where the most interesting psychological part begins. Why might it be so important for a person to control how other people see them? Magnotta used different identities, aliases, and created a certain public persona around himself. It was as if he was not simply living his own life. He was creating a character. And this reveals one of the strangest properties of the human psyche. We do not simply want to be someone. Sometimes we want other people to believe in our version of who we are. That is why the Magnotta case is not simply a story about a crime. It is a story about identity, attention, manipulation, and the dangerous desire to control one's image in the minds of others. Dennis Rader, the man who wanted people to be afraid of him. Dennis Rader, known as BTK, killed 10 people in Kansas over approximately 17 years. His first victims were the Otero family, a father, mother, and 2 children. Later, he continued attacking other people. But the strangest part of his story began after the crimes. Rader sent letters to police and journalists in which he talked about his crimes. He wanted attention. He wanted society to know about BTK. And even after a long break, he began contacting the police again. In 2005, he was finally arrested. Psychologically, this is very interesting, because here the crime is not only about violence, it is also about the need to control other people's attention. Rader seemed to create a scenario in which the police, journalists, and ordinary people became participants in his game. He did not just want to commit crimes, he wanted to control the fear of an entire society. And this need to be noticed may be one of the most disturbing traits in the behavior of some serial offenders. Erin Patterson, the lunch after which 3 people died. Imagine an ordinary family lunch. The table is set, the food is served, people are talking. No one even suspects that within a few hours, one of them may end up in the hospital, while 3 others will be dead. This is exactly how one of Australia's most unusual criminal stories of recent years began. In July 2023, Erin Patterson invited relatives of her former husband to lunch. The main dish was beef Wellington with mushrooms. It was later discovered that the food contained deadly death cap mushrooms. After the lunch, 4 guests became ill. 3. Patterson's former in-laws and another relative died. The 4th guest, Ian Wilkinson, survived after severe poisoning. Patterson insisted that the poisoning was accidental, but the prosecution argued that the mushrooms had been added deliberately. In 2025, the court found Patterson guilty of 3 murders and 1 attempted murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years without the possibility of parole. As of August 19, 2026, she is appealing the conviction. But psychologically, this case is interesting not only because of the question, did she do it intentionally? The more interesting question is something else. If a person really plans such a complex crime, how can they behave completely calmly afterward? But if they truly did not plan the murders, how can all the circumstances surrounding this tragedy be explained? This is where one of the most interesting topics in criminal psychology emerges. The mismatch between a person's outward behavior and what may actually be happening inside their mind. We tend to think that a guilty person will inevitably be nervous, cry, or behave strangely. But this is not a universal rule. People react to stress, fear, and accusations in completely different ways. Some display strong emotions, some shut down, and some may appear surprisingly calm. And this is exactly why the Patterson case became so fascinating to the public. There is no obvious image of a monster here. There is a family conflict, a mysterious dinner, deadly mushrooms, controversial evidence, and a woman who continues to deny that her actions were intentional. And the most interesting question remains unanswered. Can we really determine that a person is lying simply by observing their behavior? Perhaps that is exactly what makes this story so disturbing. Because sometimes the hardest part of criminal psychology is not understanding what a person did. It is understanding why they continue to say that they did not do it. Aileen Wuornos, when the past becomes part of the crime. In the early 1990s, Aileen Wuornos was convicted of killing several men in Florida. She claimed that she killed some of the victims in self-defense, stating that the men had attacked her or attempted to do so. The prosecution presented a different version, a series of intentional murders committed for the purpose of robbery. Ultimately, Wuornos was sentenced to death and executed in 2002. Her life before the crimes was extremely unstable and connected to traumatic experiences. But here, an extremely important clarification must be made. Trauma does not make someone a murderer. Millions of people experience abuse, loss, a difficult childhood, or other traumatic events and never become criminals. Therefore, psychology does not look for one magical cause. It tries to understand an entire system. Personality, experience, environment, mental state, motivation, and specific circumstances. What actually connects these stories? A mother who killed her children and whose mental state became the central issue in court. A man who destroyed his own family while simultaneously maintaining the image of an ordinary father. A person who turned a crime into part of his own public persona. A serial killer who demanded the attention of the police for years. At first glance, these are completely different stories, but that is exactly why they are so interesting from a psychological perspective. There is no single, universal profile of a murderer. A dangerous person does not necessarily look aggressive. Not every criminal has a mental disorder, and having a mental disorder does not mean that a person is dangerous. Sometimes the key may be control. Sometimes manipulation. Sometimes pathological fantasies. Sometimes a psychotic state. And sometimes we still cannot explain exactly why a person did what they did. And perhaps this is the most frightening question of all. Can we ever truly understand what is happening inside another person's mind until they themselves show us their true side? If you're interested in dark psychology, manipulation, and the most mysterious sides of human behavior, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments, what other famous criminal case should we examine specifically from a psychological perspective?